Joanna Sampson was pushed onto the floor next to the body of her husband. She raised her arms to break her fall, but they collapsed as soon as her hands touched the carpet, and she slumped down, her head brushing against the wall beside her. She felt numb, yet she was in pain, especially the deep burning between her legs, but the pain seemed distant, as if anesthetized by the gathering fog in her mind. The right side of her face felt larger than usual, a dull ache spreading down from her closed eye and around the bottom of her jaw. She could taste the salty copper of blood in her mouth as she looked across with her undamaged eye and saw her husband lying beside her. He was motionless, his expression peaceful, as if sleeping, and his face wasn't beaten as hers had been moments earlier. But she could see blood beginning to congeal within the greying hairs on the side of his head, and wondered if he was unconscious or dead. She couldn't be sure, but tried to focus her thoughts through the fog of confusion that was beginning to overwhelm her. She suddenly heard the echo of a distant scream, then a voice pleading, and for a reason which wouldn't come to her, she believed the sound was closer than it appeared. She raised her head and saw some blurred shadows moving through the room. Then the voice pleaded again, and Joanna suddenly realized that it was a voice she recognized. The men had arrived at the front door to her home earlier that evening. Joanna mentioned to her husband, Leonard, that she thought she had heard a knock at the door, but he hadn't heard anything. The second set of knocks was louder, the kind made with the side of a fist, and the door shook, the sound of wood on wood rattling through the hallway. Joanna glanced to her husband, who was sitting in his chair reading, and shot him an "I told you so" smile. He smiled back and shrugged as she walked past. The chain was attached, as it always was in the evening, and Joanna opened the door to the limit permitted by the interlocking rings. As she peered through the gap, she saw two men staring back at her, one short and stocky, with a thick brown beard covering most of his face, with another shuffling behind him. The second man was taller, but was standing with a slightly hunched posture, and his skin bore deep crevasses, revealing a history of acne. She waited for them to introduce themselves, expecting the thrust of a sales brochure or religious leaflet into her hand, but she was met with only a lingering and uncomfortable silence. She realized her own expression was caught somewhere between a confused frown and a polite smile as she stood waiting for them to say something, and she was about to ask what they wanted when the stocky man suddenly lurched forward. He swung his leg out before him as he lunged towards her. The kick was hard, and the door swung back, tearing the screws from the wall that secured the chain. A sudden panic washed over Joanna, and she was thrown back against the opposite wall as the door was flung open on its hinges, crashing against a family portrait. Before she could gather her thoughts, the two men had pushed their way through the doorway, and her vision was filled with blurred shapes as the two men entered with fluid and precise movements. It took barely a second before they were both inside, with the taller man turning and slamming the door behind him. Joanna heard her husband get up and come through the lounge door, and she looked on with rising terror as she saw the shorter of the two men pull something from under his long coat. She heard herself scream as her eyes focused on the golf club, but then a huge hand covered her mouth and dragged her to the opposite side of the hallway, silencing her. It was the taller man. He had curled his arm around her neck, wrenching her away from her husband, and Joanna fought desperately, reaching out for anything close by, the walls, the banister, but it was useless. The hand covered half her face, fingers pushed tightly over her nose, and she could barely breathe as she twisted and writhed to break free of his grasp. She looked over to her husband with bulging eyes, and he returned her gaze, his face draining of colour as the stocky man raised the club in both hands before bringing it down. Leonard instinctively shrunk back, raising his thin arms above his head in self-defence. He crouched as the head of the club came down on his wrist, and grimaced as the blow was followed by several more. The tall man adjusted his grip, and Joanna managed to drag some air in through her mouth. Tears had blurred her vision, but she watched in terror as the stocky man...
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.